Welcome everyone. You are listening to the account with a news summary for day 369 of the war in Ukraine. Thank you for tuning in. I forgot to mention it, but I'm traveling for a week, so I'm using my mobile setup. I'm sorry if the sound quality is not as good as usual. Today I have several extra segments. For once, I will go over the most important updates and the UK Ministry of Defence update from yesterday, day 368 of the war. After, we have another interview with Kirill Budanov, and we have the Russian Shahed UAV attack on Ukraine. The rest of the updates are grouped into the usual: situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, with updates on the Machulishchy airbase incident, and the international developments. But before we start the report, a quick recap of yesterday's events. Imagery shows concentrated Russian vehicle losses in the Volodar sector of Donetsk Oblast. These vehicles were likely elements of Russia's 155th Naval Infantry NI Brigade, which has been at the forefront of recent costly offensives. NI is seen as an elite infantry force within the Russian military. Unlike the similarly prestigious airborne infantry VDV, NI has not deployed as a single large formation in Ukraine. Instead, individual units have been attached to ground forces-dominated groups of forces. As such, NI has been tasked with some of the toughest tactical missions in the war and has suffered extremely high casualties. The supposedly enhanced capability of NI brigades has now almost certainly been significantly degraded because it has been backfiled with inexperienced mobilized personnel. This lack of experience is almost certainly exacerbating Russian officers' tendency to micromanage, which in turn reduces operational agility. There is a realistic possibility that degraded NI units will again be committed to new assaults near Volodar. Yesterday was the 9th anniversary of the occupation of Crimea. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated, "This is our land, our people, our history. We will return the Ukrainian flag to every corner of Ukraine." A Russian A-50U was damaged at the Machulishchy airbase near Minsk. The Air and Space Forces of the Russian Federation have only 9 A-50 aircraft, and only 6 of them are improved with the U modification. One of them was damaged. And now for a look at the flashpoints along the front. Bakhmut. North of Bakhmut, the situation remains critical. Yesterday, Ukraine reported repelled attacks at Budanivka, which could indicate Russia either captured Berhivka or bypassed it. South of Bakhmut, the situation remains stable. It is reported Ukraine managed to recapture some positions. A Ukrainian counterattack was reported in the area of Ivanivsk. To start the news segment, Russia's latest UAV attack on Ukraine. Russia launched 14 Shahed UAVs at Ukraine last night. 11 were shot down, 9 over Kyiv. In Chernihiv, it was reported that 3 drones were shot down. In Khmelnytsky, explosions were reported. 1 person was killed and 4 more were injured as a result of an enemy drone attack. Later, it was reported that 1 more rescue worker died in the hospital. Yuri Inat, spokesperson for the Air Force of Ukraine, explained that Russia is using these drone attacks to probe Ukrainian air defenses and exhaust its ammunition. And now the interview with Chief of the Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Major General Kirill Budanov. According to Budanov, Russia is not ready for a long-term war due to limited resources, although it tries to demonstrate the opposite. He further stated that the sooner Russia gives Ukraine peace, the more chances it will have to preserve its own integrity. Budanov went on to explain that in the next 3 months, active fighting will take place on the eastern and southern fronts, and that Russia tries to buy and import weapons through any countries possible and is now trying to negotiate this issue with Myanmar. He also mentioned that there are now more people in Russian captivity than in Ukrainian captivity, but about 40% of those held by the Russians are civilians. Everything that the Russians feared the most became a reality because they launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Budanov stated. Moving on to all the minor news updates out of Ukraine. According to Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malyar, Russia is intensifying its assault in the east. Especially Bakhmut is in a difficult situation for Ukraine. Russian attacks in the Khmelnytsky, Kyiv, Donetsk, Kherson, Kharkiv, Sumy, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Luhansk oblasts have killed 3 civilians and injured 8 today. The US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has arrived in Kyiv for a visit. She discussed the role of the private sector in rebuilding destroyed Ukrainian infrastructure with President Zelensky. Soldiers of the newly formed Offensive or Assault Guard will be tasked with a variety of operations, including assault missions, purge operations, and liberation of territories. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. According to Petro Andriushchenko, the advisor to the Mariupol mayor, the movement and arrival of Russian equipment and personnel has been recorded in the city. The General Staff of Ukraine reported in its morning update that Russian occupation authorities in Oleshki and Skadovsk, Kherson Oblast, are preparing to flee to the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimea. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. A day after the explosions at the Machulishchy airfield near Minsk, Belarusian border guards significantly increased exit controls from the country. The Belarusian opposition claimed partisans attacked the Russian plane with a drone. It was reported that the participants of the alleged sabotage already left Belarus and are now safe. Satellite images were published by Planet Labs, allegedly showing the aircraft likely attacked by Belarusian partisans. Dmitry Peskov, press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, has refused to comment on the incident at the airfield in Belarus. Meanwhile, the President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has held a meeting with security forces following the attack on the military airfield. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. According to the director of the CIA, William Burns, the head of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, was alarmed by the failures of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the war against Ukraine. The European Commission and Poland announced a joint initiative to find Ukrainian children illegally taken by the Russian army from occupied territories. The initiative, which has the support of the United Nations, aims to collect evidence that will help them track down where in Russia these Ukrainian children were brought and to bring charges against those who abducted them. Poland has announced that it will be sending the next batch of Leopard 2A4 tanks within the next few weeks. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting with the UK Ministry of Defence. Since February 21, 2023, pro-Russian officials have reported at least 14 explosions around the Russian-occupied city of Mariupol. Sites of the incidents have included an ammo cache at the airport, 2 fuel depots, and a steelworks that Russia uses as a military base. Mariupol lies at least 80 kilometers away from the front line. Russia will likely be concerned that unexplained explosions are occurring in a zone it had probably previously assessed as beyond the range of routine Ukrainian strike capabilities. Although widely devastated earlier in the war, Mariupol is important to Russia because it is the largest city Russia captured in 2022 that it still controls and sits on a key logistic route. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. The Institute has published an abbreviated campaign update today. This report focuses on Russian President Vladimir Putin's attempt to avoid ordering involuntary mobilization by launching a series of irregular volunteer force generation campaigns since late May 2022 and the consequences of that attempt. The key takeaway is, analysts assume that manpower reserves in the Russian army are not endless. According to the researchers, last year, losses at the front were made up for by the so-called partial mobilization. The Institute assumes that Russia likely began to run out of combat-ready forces by late May 2022. Now, to make up for the renewed losses of Russia, Putin may have to consider expanding conscription by involving more and more young Russian men against their will in military service. Although, as analysts point out, the country's demographics do not favor such an approach. According to estimates, 800,000 young people reach the age of 18 in Russia every year, while 260,000 Russians are called up for military service. Expanding conscription beyond 260,000 people will result in the army recruiting citizens who are physically unfit for service. This will also reduce the number of Russians involved in the country's economy, which Putin is trying to put on a military track, analysts say. And to wrap up the news report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The Russian Federation continues to wage full-scale armed aggression against Ukraine. The enemy concentrates its main efforts on conducting offensive actions in the Kupiansk, Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Shakhtarsk directions and increases the number of personnel. According to available information, up to 200 conscripts from the Rostov region were transferred to the temporarily occupied territory of the Luhansk Oblast. During the current day, the enemy has launched 8 missile and 28 airstrikes, 12 of them by Iranian strike UAVs of the Shahed 136 type. The enemy carried out more than 55 attacks from rocket salvo systems. The threat of missile strikes remains high throughout the territory of Ukraine. In particular, in the direction of the settlements of Stelmakivka, Nevske, Bilohorivka of Luhansk Oblast, and Spirne and Vimka, Donetsk Oblast. The enemy continues to attack the positions of our troops in the Avdiivka and Shakhtarsk directions and has carried out several unsuccessful attacks in the direction of Kamyanka, Krasnohorivka, and Marinka Donetsk Oblast. The enemy continues to suffer losses. Therefore, to provide medical assistance to its servicemen, it actively uses local infrastructure in temporarily occupied territories. Thus, a military hospital has been set up in the village of Kalanchak on the basis of a local hospital. About 150 wounded servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation have already been brought there. According to available information, the medical staff are exclusively Russians. The enemy continues to take measures to discredit the defense forces of Ukraine and intimidate residents of the temporarily occupied part of Kherson Oblast. The enemy again shelled the residential quarters of Machulishchy with mortars and blamed the armed forces for this. And that concludes today's episode. As usual, I included the links to all the articles I mentioned in the description in case you want to read up on them. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.